Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lisa Perrotti-Brown, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Robert Parker Wine Advocate and the reviewer for Bordeaux and Napa. Today, we're going to taste 6 amazing wines from the 2010 vintage in Bordeaux. Just before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how this virtual tour is possible with these small bottles. Now, I'll tell you that we have purchased directly all of these wines that we're tasting today from the Chateau. And then we had the bottles shipped to Texas, where they were rebottled into these little 50 cl PET bottles under hermetic conditions, under inert conditions, so that there's no chance of oxidation. It was done, all of the quality control was supervised by an enologist. I'm pretty impressed. This is the first time that I've worked with these guys. We've worked with the tubes before. And I have to say, I popped these open about an hour and a half ago, and I'm pretty impressed with the quality that we've got going on here. Looking very good. I would therefore urge you all to open your bottles now if you haven't done so already. Hopefully you've got 6 glasses, because I think as much air as you can get into these samples is best. The 2010 vintage, which I'll go over in just a moment, is a vintage that is shut down for quite some time. Some of the wines are just starting to wake up, but they do need a good amount of air. It's a very tannic vintage with a lot of structure. So if you haven't done so already, get your glasses ready, and please open the bottles now, pour them into your glass, give them a chance to get some air in them. As I mentioned, I opened mine about an hour and a half ago, and they have gone through like all sorts of waves of, some of them were open when I first opened them up, and then they shut down, and then others emerged miraculously when they were very shut down at the beginning. So it's so much fun to see them in their various different stages when they're this young. First thing I'm going to do is give you an overview of the 2010 vintage in Bordeaux. And I am afraid this will be something of a whirlwind tour of 6 of the greatest terroirs of Bordeaux. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pose them at any time. And I'll try and tackle the questions as they arise. I've got a monitor over here that's got the questions as they're coming up. Otherwise, if I don't get to your questions straight away, we will have a little bit of time at the end to go over some of the questions. 2010. Very dry year. In fact, it was the second drought year in a row. 2009 was also a very dry year, drier even than the growing seasons of 2005 or 2009. And it started out quite warm and dry, and then it ended up relatively cool and dry. Now, these factors can be great for quality, but they're not without risk. Since, as everyone knows, irrigation is not possible in Bordeaux, there was a risk that some of the vines struggled after veraison and didn't have sufficient sunshine or heat in August to complete the phenolic and tannic ripening before the impact of hydric stress really started to take hold. Meanwhile, the sugars continue to accumulate in the grapes, increasing the potential alcohol levels. A certain amount of berry shrivel, it's when the berries actually shrivel on the vine. This can be a consequence of dehydration. Concentrated those sugars even more. And sometimes when you get winds as well, it concentrates them even more. We see that here in Napa and some vintages too. So come September, the grapes really required further ripening, as they usually do in Bordeaux, and further hang time on both banks in an effort to achieve full tannin and flavor ripeness, which in part accounts for some of the resulting higher alcohols that we see this vintage. Winemakers were really walking that fine line between how much hydric stress the vines could take before they just stopped, and the wait for optimal ripeness. So that was all the key factors there. In short, the communes and vineyards with soil profiles and with older vines with those more extensive root systems that could really seek out the water in the soil from way down could mitigate the impact of the hydric stress that year. And they went on to produce some extraordinary wines in 2010. And we've got 6 examples here. But most notable was the consistency of quality coming from the deeper clay soils of Pomerol and the limestone-based soils on the Saint-Emilion Plateau, and elsewhere where clay or limestone predominates on the right bank. Likewise, in parts of Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, and Pessac-Léognan, where there were layers of clay amongst the gravel, they tended to do better than the very deep, pure gravel soil profiles. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to each of the separate communes. And the what looks like a pure gravel outcrop there of just, pebbles. It may look just like it's pure pebbles there, but there are layers of clay in there that actually give the vines that right amount of freshness, even in drier years, that you see in there. And that's quite common across some of the best vineyards of Pauillac. So we'll move straight on to Pishon Baron, our first wine. Château Pishon Baron, or Pichon-Longueville as it's also called, is in fact right across the D2 from Château Latour, that vineyard that we just looked at. And as you may know, Pishon Baron and Pichon-Lalande were once part of the same large estate until the estate was divided by Baron Joseph de Pichon-Longueville between his 5 children, with Pishon Baron going to his 2 male heirs, and what would become Pichon-Lalande going to his 3 daughters. Then the estate stayed in the Longueville family until the 1930s. It unfortunately fell into something of a period of disrepair during the 1960s and 70s, largely due to lack of investment. And then in 1987, it was purchased by the current owners, Axum Millésime, who put Jean-Michel Caz in charge. And we can start to see the consistency of quality really start to turn around. The very striking new facilities that you see if you've ever driven past or visited, indeed, Pishon Baron, were completed in 1991. So it's a pretty amazing chateau and winemaking facilities there. Oops, that's Château Latour. In 2000, Christian Seely took over the management of the estate, and quality has continued its upward trajectory ever since, which has much to do, in my view, with selection, using only the best parcels and the best fruit that's available there. So like most Pauillac Chateau, Pishon Baron has parcels scattered throughout Pauillac, but its best terroir is about, there you can see it, that's Pishon Baron. And you can see this terroir that I'm talking about right there, sort of sloping there, or it looks like it's sloping there. Its best terroir is around 100 acres located on the plateau that's just south of the chateau and to the west of Latour, bordering on Saint-Julien. It's actually Château Léoville Poiferet's vineyard there. And it consists of gravel over an iron-rich clay, which is mainly planted to Cabernet Sauvignon and produces outstanding Cabernet Sauvignon. So that's really what we're looking at with the more recent vintages is a lot of the Grand Vin coming from that section of vineyard, which is the sort of sweet spot for the chateau. On to the tasting. Okay, so Pauillac tends to produce, in my view, these powerful muscular wines that are very structured with some very firm tannins, and they can be really shut down in their youth. The best wines are very tight-knit and take many years to come around, but they have amazing cellaring potential. Now, modern Pishon Baron tends to reveal the richer side of Pauillac for me. It's more opulent with these beautiful fine-grained tannins and flamboyant black fruits. The 2010 Pishon Baron is a blend of 79% Cabernet Sauvignon and 21% Merlot, which represents about 50% of the total production that year. And it was matured in 80% new oak for about 18 months. For me, I just love this wine. It was one of those wines where it, when I first poured it into the glass, it just popped. It was like, lots of fruit, and it was really sort of singing. What I like about it now, again, about an hour and a half, 2 hours later, it's really starting to show some of those exotic spices in there. And that kind of incense almost character, some cigar box in there as well. But you do have that core of black cherries and dark chocolate. There's a little bit of potpourri. And I love the plushness of the tannins on here, with a little bit softer acidity maybe than some of the wines in 2010. Just gorgeous. Okay, moving on to wine number 2. We're in Saint-Julien. Now, Saint-Julien is the smallest of the major Medoc communes, with a large proportion of the area under vine belonging to a very small clutch of classified groves. As in Pauillac, the soil is defined by deep Gunsian gravel and does tend to have more gravel even than Pauillac. But there are a lot of clay bands in the subsoil. Now, this photo is a photo that I took at Ducru Beaucaillou, where you can actually see there's a bit more clay interspersed with that gravel there. Ducru also has an enviable swathe of this gravel dense vineyard that hugs the riverbank, a bit like that parcel that we saw at Latour. But this parcel that you see in the picture is a little bit more inland from the estuary. In fact, it's across the D2. And there you can see where you start to get a little bit more clay into some of the outcrops. As you may know, coming back to the tasting of the wine, and I do invite you to taste the wine now. The 3 Léoville estates used to be one estate, so Léoville Barton, Léoville Poifferet, and Léoville Lescasse, but were split following the French Revolution. Today, Léoville Lescasse is owned by the Delon family, now Jean Hubert Delon, and managed by Pierre Graffoy. The vineyard consists of about 125 different parcels, but the heart of the estate is what you're seeing here in the picture here. It's this enclosed clos that sits very near the river. And in fact, you can see the river from where it is. And it's just across from that parcel that I showed you of Latour. So they are bordering each other with a little kind of like marshy waterway in between the two that separates marks the border there between Saint-Julien and Pauillac. As you can guess, that clos is mainly made up of a plateau of deep gravel, but as it sort of slopes down a little bit, you've got some well-draining sandy gravel with a clay subsoil that's actually planted to Merlot, some very good quality Merlot that comes from that area. So the style here at Léoville Lescasse, I find, is much more sort of concentrated and opulent than other Saint-Juliens, with a firmer backbone. It does, in many respects, and in some vintages, behave more like a Pauillac than a Saint-Julien, except it does tend to have more perfume, I find, and maybe a little bit more decadence, maybe just a little bit more open in its youth than perhaps its Latour counterpart just across the border there. The wines of Saint-Julien tend to be more elegant, restrained, and generally had this well-defined fruit layers with plusher tannins than a lot of Pauillac wines. They tend to show more expression and perfume in youth, but they can still be very similarly long-lived, depending on the vintage, of course. Modern Léoville Lescasse can be powerful and muscular like a Pauillac, but when it's really shining like this, and this is a great vintage of Léoville Lescasse, it has this really delicate, beautiful perfume and a minerality that is kind of not Pauillac or Saint-Julien. It's exclusively Léoville Lescasse to me. This 2010 is a blend of 82% Cabernet Sauvignon, 10% Merlot, and 8% Cabernet Franc. Interestingly, it has a pH that's relatively low. It's 3.56, so that means relatively high acidity, particularly for such a ripe, rich year. It was matured in about 75% new oak, and the alcohol came in at 13.7%. I think that's the lowest alcohol of any of the wines that we're looking at today. So maybe they're just a little bit more delicate than the other ones. It does have a powerful fragrance, though. I get roses and candied violets over that like classic cassis and cedar chest. It's a very complex wine. What I do love about it as well is the very fine grained tannins on here. Really ripe, very fine grained tannins coming from the Cabernet. And that beautiful acidity, as I said, maybe just a little bit higher acidity than the other ones as well, giving it wonderful freshness. Okay, we can go on to the next pair of wines. Now it's number 3 and 4 now. Wine number 3, of course, is from Margot, and wine number 4 from Pessac-Léognan. Now, both Margot and Pessac-Léognan are relatively large communes separated by the city of Bordeaux. Parts of Margot are known to have even more gravel in the profile than Pauillac. And there are some very deep gravel and well-drained sections, particularly as you're going to that first plateau there by the Gironde, or by the river. But Margot is a very large commune, which extends a lot further away from the Gironde River estuary than the other regions that we've looked at, or the other major Medoc regions. In this picture, you can see a vineyard that sits right between Rosanne-Segla and Château Palmer. You can just about make out Palmer there in the background, with more visible clay in the profile. And also you can perhaps see gravels that are a little bit finer. The gravel here is just a little bit smaller. We saw some quite sort of chunky gravel when we were up in Pauillac and in Saint-Julien. Here, the gravel tends to be, I find, a little bit finer, a little bit smaller, more pebble-like than the larger stones up to the north. And the vineyards of deep gravel, there you can see a great picture of it. That's actually at Château Palmer. The vineyards of deep gravel, such as those closer to the limestone in the subsoil. Limestone has a fantastic water holding capacity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get over to the right bank, which has a lot more limestone in the soil profiles generally. But you do see some in the Medoc, and you certainly see some in areas of Margot where it's a subsoil there that does add some accessibility to moisture during these drier vintages in particular vineyard sites, which is a bonus in very dry years like 2010 was. Right, on to Château Palmer. Here you're seeing some images of Château Palmer, and these are modern images of Château Palmer. Going back to the history of the chateau, Château Palmer takes its name from an English general named Charles Palmer, who purchased the property in 1814. And that's generally why we say Palmer rather than Palme. After he went bankrupt, it was sold in 1853 to a wealthy Parisian family who built the glamorous chateau, the sort of fairy tale chateau that you see today, and expanded the vineyards, but kept the name. The chateau and most of the current vineyard area are located in the Cantonex subcommune of Margot, not far away from Chateau Margaux, actually. And most of the Cabernet is situated on that first terrace that I referred to earlier, or plateau that's located around the chateau. Now, it's worth noting that these prime blocks were not part of the estate in 1855, which is probably why it was then deemed only a third growth and not a second or maybe even a first growth, which a lot of people consider it today when you look at the quality that's coming from it. The soils of the 135-acre estate are incredibly varied here, mainly consisting of gravel, but with a good proportion of clay too. From 1945, a large percentage of Merlot was planted at the estate, and it continues to have one of the highest percentages of this grape planted for a Medoc chateau. So the Merlot is relegated. Merlot is usually relegated in I hate to say it, in the Medoc to the poorer soils, but not so at Palmer. At Palmer, they put it on the top soils right around the chateau as well. And that's why you get a really great quality of Merlot coming from Palmer in particular too. They also have some very old vines that are still in production at Château Palmer. Some of them are 70 years or more old. In the 1930s, Palmer was purchased by a group of shareholders consisting of 4 of Bordeaux's most powerful and well-known families or négociants at the time. And today, the majority stake remains with 2 of those négociants, Seychelles and Malabès. In 2004, Thomas Deroux took over as winemaker. And I think that was a magic moment because he really continued to take Palmer into its next level, its next stage, its next iteration. And he started experimenting with biodynamic viticulture in 2008, and Palmer went fully biodynamic in 2014, which was quite some feat. I mean, not easy to do in Bordeaux. We see it also at Ponticane, for example, but very few other estates going fully biodynamic like that and certified biodynamic. So it's pretty impressive. Right, let's get to the tasting. Well, Great Margot for me is, many people call it feminine. I like to say it has this evocative perfume. It really is fragrant, graceful, elegant, and really very, very plush in terms of the tannins, very soft, very softly spoken. Palmer is a little bit in contrast to that because it does tend to be a bit richer and more opulent than a lot of Margot wines. Much of that is thanks to that extra proportion of Merlot that goes in there. And as I said, very good quality Merlot. So it tends to be a little bit more fuller bodied than many of its peers. And in a warm vintage, it can be absolutely hedonic. We saw that with the 2018 Palmer. In particular. This 2010 is a blend of 54% Merlot, 40% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 6% Petit Verdot. It does tend to have a little bit more Petit Verdot than other Medoc properties too. The alcohol level weighed in at 14.5%. So if you compare that to the level of Lascasse, which we had at 13.7%, it is pretty weighty, and it measures up with the right bank wines in the Pishon Baron that we're about to look at. Here, you know, tasting the wine, it's just so rich, hedonic. It seems to be literally evolving as I smell and taste it. It's just like it almost kind of seems to shimmer with, you know, showing different faces of itself each time that you look at it. It's quite an amazing wine. But what I'm really struck with is the richness and the texture on this wine, very velvety. But it still has beautiful harmony as well for all that richness and weight to it. Sorry, I have tasted all of these before. I'm just going to have to taste that one again. So it's so beautiful. Okay, moving on to Pishon. Pishon is even larger and more varied commune than Margot was. In truth, the estate should probably be discussed in the context of either of the 2 major subcommunes into which they fall. So we've got Pishon, which is at the north of the commune, and Léognan down towards the south. Pishon, of course, spills into the city of Bordeaux, and we get, you know, properties like Haut-Brion, which are you know, really in the center of Bordeaux, almost, well, on the edge of the city of Bordeaux, and Pape Clément that we're looking at now. Our wine, of course, the Pape Clément, comes from the Pishon area, which is not so dissimilar in terms of terroir profile than the Medoc. Here you can see a picture I took at Haut-Brion, which you see the very similar Gunsian gravels there in the soil profile. A lot of gravel, a lot of clay mixed in there as well. In Pishon or in Pishon, there does tend to be some areas or great swathes of clays as well, which makes it more suitable for a good proportion of Merlot, which is why you tend to get more of a 50-50 balance of Cabernets and Merlots than you do in the Medoc, which is predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. Pape Clément is situated very close to Aubryon, just on the edge of Bordeaux City, as I mentioned before. It is the oldest estate still in production in Bordeaux, dating back to 1252. The Château Pape Clément gets its name from one of the original owners, who was elected Pope Clément V in 1305. And in 1309, Leo Montague purchased the estate. And some years later, Bernard Margot, who married into the family, came on board, and he runs the property today. And I have to say, Bernard Margot has gone to great lengths and spared no expense to take it up to the standard that it is today, which is just incredible. In terms of the taste of Figeac, for me, it tends to produce wines of amazing precision, delivering clear cassis and plum aromas and flavors, laced with notable earthy crushed rocks characters and beautifully rounded, almost pebble-like tannins that are like that soil that we saw. At Pape Clément, the wines are powerful expressions of Figeac. Real contrast to what we see, for example, at Aubryon or at La Mission-Aubryon. They tend to be vibrant and bold with a firm background, fanning out with cellaring to reveal breathtaking aromatic complexity. When I first poured this, and I got like a lot of oak on the nose, but now, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, the fruit is really coming forward, and it's just so opulent. It really is very rich, sort of almost plum preserves, blueberry pie, and creme de cassis here, with a sort of nuances of tobacco and new leather, and Chinese five spice, and so much going on here. This 2010 Pape Clément is 51% Merlot, 47.5% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 1.5% Petit Verdot. And the alcohol comes in at, in fact, the blend is very similar to the Palmer that we just tasted, and the alcohol level is very similar as well at 14.5%. But very, very different expressions. Just beautiful. Okay. We will move on to wines 5 and 6 now. We're going to hop on over to the right bank. We're in Saint-Emilion and Pomerol here. Both Saint-Emilion and Pomerol are located on the right bank of the Gironde estuary, and here Merlot, usually but not always, is the major grape, with Cabernet Franc usually playing a supporting role and occasionally a dominating role. We're seeing actually Cabernet Franc come to the forefront more and more in recent years. Part of that has to do with trend, and part of it has to do with warmer vintages and Cabernet Franc bringing about a kind of brightness to the wines that's very, very interesting. A little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon is sometimes grown on the freer draining soils of the right bank, but often it's omitted completely. So oftentimes you don't see any Cabernet Sauvignon in the blends, but we're starting to see it sneak in a little bit more. And again, I think it has to do with people really understanding their terroirs there on the right bank, and realizing, okay, we've got a bit more gravel or sandy or freer draining soil here. It's better suited to Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon even than to the Merlot. Part of it has to do with that sort of freshness and brightness that Cabernet Sauvignon can lend to a rich hedonic blend. But of course, the reason that Merlot works so well on this side of the river is because of the predominance of clay and limestone in the soils and in the subsoils that tend to work better with Merlot, which does like a little bit more water than Cabernet Sauvignon and indeed Cabernet Franc. So Saint-Emilion is a far larger and more varied commune than Pomerol. At over 5,000 hectares, or that must be around 12,000 acres under vine. It accounts for about 5% of the total area of Bordeaux. But here there tends to be more Cabernet Franc planted than in Pomerol, with the exception of some estates like La Fleur, which has a good amount of Cabernet Franc planted. So Cabernet Franc in Saint-Emilion represents about 25% of the plantings of the region. these soils of Saint-Emilion, I mean, it's such a vast area, are incredibly varied. And the famous limestone plateau that I don't know if you saw it from that picture there from Chateau Canon that I had, consists of clay and loam over a thick layer of limestone or calcaire, as they call it, there. And this just has amazing sort of water holding capacity. It really is quite incredible to taste in a dry or hot vintage wines coming from that plateau area, or the limestone plateau, because they just maintain such freshness and such vibrancy of fruit. We're not talking about the limestone plateau today for Château Figeac, though. I just wanted to sort of contrast the two major types of soils. Figeac comes from a lower lying area, not far from Cheval Blanc. In fact, it's kind of just across the road from Cheval Blanc and very close to the Pomerol border, where you've got a lot of freer draining soils that are made up of gravel and sands. And that's kind of the justification there for having a large proportion at Figeac and at Cheval Blanc of Cabernet Franc, but at Figeac also of Cabernet Sauvignon. So Château Figeac is one of Bordeaux's oldest estates. It dates right back to Roman times, which is where it gets its name from. It's been in the Manoncourt family since the 1890s, and it was classified as a Premier Grand Cru Classé B in Saint-Emilion in 1955 and has remained so ever since. There's a lot of speculation. Obviously, they're going through bit of a kerfuffle with the current reclassification of Saint-Emilion, but there's a lot of speculation whether it will be upgraded to a Premier Grand Cru Classé A during this next iteration. So we'll have to wait and see. As I mentioned, Château Figeac is located on the lower lying edge of Saint-Emilion towards the border of Pomerol. And consists of those gravelly soils that you just saw there. It almost looks like you're in the Médoc. And again, this is the justification for the planting. So it's a 103 acres vineyard, which is quite a large vineyard for right bank standards. It's planted to 35% Cabernet Franc, 35% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 30% Merlot. So that's a very unusual mix. Usually you get mostly Merlot. In some cases you get a good portion of Cabernet Franc, but more likely it's around 5 or 10%. So here they're really taking advantage of what their soil type is and matching the varieties to it. A lot of that is thanks to the current manager of the estate, Frédéric Fay, who has wisely been increasing the Cabernet plantings here. And the result is a slightly more austere, youthfully reticent style that really takes time to strut its stuff. I can remember, the wines of Thierry Manoncourt, who was in charge of the estate for a very long time. And they were even more austere, maybe a little bit more sort of elegant, not quite so ripe as they are now, but, more on that sort of slightly underripe character, but took many years to come around. And when they did, they blossomed beautifully. The sort of signature of the estate now is a much more sort of intense, concentrated style of wine that has beautifully ripe tannins and just a sort of muscular way about it until it's had a few years at bottle age. I love how this Figeac is looking today. Again, it was quite closed when I first poured it out, and it's just starting to sort of wake up now. And if you just poured the wine when we started the masterclass or the webinar, you might want to leave this wine a little bit longer in the glass to really let it wake up. But you can taste, you can smell those beautiful red and black fruits. I love that interplay of the sort of red currants versus the black currants and the blackberries. And there's a little bit of rose oil in there. Something very floral and also a sort of crushed stones kind of character in there. This 2010 Figeac is a blend of 30% Merlot, 35% Cabernet Franc, and 35% Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's not unusual. It's usually, or nowadays I should say, it's about a third of each of those grape varieties there. just beautiful on the nose now. And last but not least, we're going to head over to Pomerol. Well, Pomerol is just a tiny little nugget of a commune, even smaller than Saint-Julien that we looked at only about 790 hectares in total, which would be about 1,700, I guess, acres or so. Pomerol is probably best known for its clay soils, including the famous outcrops of Cras de Fer, or the blue clay that exists most famously in Petrus. But there's also a lot of gravel and a lot of sand in the profiles of Pomerol. So it's a very small area, but there's a lot going on there in terms of different soil types. And you know, it's amazing how you can very much taste the difference, you know, according to what the terroir is there. Here you can see in the soil there's quite a lot of gravel. There's a little bit of sand in that soil, all, you know, held together by a heavy sort of rich clay there. The iron-rich blue clay, just coming back to that because it is going to a signature or part and parcel of the wine that we're going to be looking at, is associated with a lot of wines of quality. There's a little bit of it also at La Conseillante, at Lévangile, at Gazan, at Vieux-Château-Certain, and at Trotanoy, which is what we're looking at. So it's an unusual kind of clay. It's an iron-rich clay that usually sits as a subsoil. There it is. It's a great picture of it. And it's actually unusual in that it's pretty much impenetrable. It's just so dense that the vines tend to, rather than penetrate it, sit on top of it. But it has amazing water holding capacity, and it does tend to provide this freshness to the vine's roots above it, even in those really hot and dry years. So it can produce these powerful, rich, and yet, you know, quite vibrant wines. And while Petrus itself is kind of like what they call the buttonhole, it's got you know, a thick layer of this and covering a lot of the estate. There are other parcels like the one that at Trotanoy that do have it in there as well. So it's quite unusual. Trotanoy has been owned by the J.P. Moix, which is the negociant arm and landholding arm of the Moix family since 1953, and is today managed by Christian Moix. Sorry, you can see there we're looking across the plateau of Pomerol towards the church spire there, and actually this is just taken from the top of La Fleur. I took this photo from La Fleur, sort of looking across the plateau there. So it's been owned by the Moixes since 1953, and it's managed by Christian Moix and his son Edouard today. It's located on the western part of the plateau, which is kind of, and it's located right in the middle of the region in general. It has mainly black clay, some deep gravel there as well, but little parts of this blue clay or this Cras de Fer too. It's just a relatively small vineyard, just over 17 acres, and it's mainly planted to Merlot, 90% Merlot, with 10% Cabernet Franc. So it's kind of difficult to pinpoint the style of a great Pomerol because it can have so many different guises, and depending on the vintage, the site, the winemaker interpretation, there's just so much going on there. But I do find that great Pomerol tends to be very coy in its youth and really earthy with a nice firm structure and great aging potential. The tannins can be quite solid and grainy. In this Trotanoy, and it from those Cras de Fer soils, I find that the tannins can almost be quite Cabernet-like. They're just very fine-grained and tight-knit, rather than a lot of Merlot tannins are much more sort of rounded and more velvety. This seems to give a firmer backbone here. Trotanoy tends to be dense and tightly knit. It really doesn't want to show itself in the early years. But when it does come around, it's got such beautiful fragrance, with some red fruits and black fruits interspersed in there, and almost like a very sort of earthy undercurrent, maybe some truffles and unsmoked cigars in there as well. Trotanoy is usually made from more or less 100% Merlot. Sometimes you can see a splash of Cabernet Franc in there from their plantings there, but usually it's nearly 100% Merlot. This Trotanoy as well was very closed when it was first opened, and it's almost like liquid rocks. It's got this sort of tar and loam kind of character on it, and with swirling you bring out those sort of that licorice and those preserved plums kind of characters, and sort of pruny kind of character. And then on the palate, it's very rich and powerful and profound. Some vintages it can be much more elegant and sort of tightly knit than this. This is quite a rich vintage for it, and just a beautiful backbone of freshness to it. Wonderful. Well, that was fun. We've tasted all 6 wines now, and we do have a little bit of time for questions. I'm just going to go through and see what we've got. Let's have a look. Somebody's asking, how does the 2010 vintage compare with 2009, and which will be longer lived? That's a really good question, because it seems on the surface of things, the simple answer would be that 2010 will be the longer lived vintage because it's got more structure, it's got higher levels of tannins, it's got more acid, it's got more richness of fruit maybe, even though 2009 has a lot of fruit to it. It's just more soft and open knit in youth. But I have recently tasted both vintages quite a lot. And 2009 seems to be, even though it was pretty much beautiful and delicious from the get-go, it does seem to be evolving very gracefully and holding its fruit incredibly well. Whereas I have, in contrast, tasted some 2010s where the tannins can be drying out just a little bit. Maybe they didn't quite get ripe enough in some areas because of the hydric stress. So it's not like you can have sort of a clear-cut answer, one's going to be longer lived than the other. I think, in the best wines of 2010, yes, they probably will outlive the 2009s. And we've got some fine examples here. When you look at, the Léoville Lisgas, for example, when you look at the Trotanoy, when you look at the Palmer, those wines will be very, very long-lived indeed. But I would more or less take it on a wine-by-wine basis, because they're both very great vintages, and there's no real simple answer to that. Right, let's see if we've got any more questions here. Do you think we will see the proportion of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon in right bank vineyards and wines increase in the future? I think we're already seeing that. We're seeing properties like Figeac planting a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc to get the numbers up. We see Pave's been doing the same since Gerard Paris took over the property, wanting to get just a little bit more Cabernet Franc, and they do have a little Cabernet Sauvignon planted there as well. I'm seeing it as something of a trend. Some of the greatest wines of the right bank are now a little bit more Cabernet Franc than Merlot. And then some of them, it's more like 50-50, like you see in Cheval Blanc. But what it does give, when you've got those freer drain profiles, and certainly when you've got drier vintages, it really plays to the Cabernet grapes. And in the blends, it can add a little bit more freshness and a little bit more structure to the wine. So yes, I think we will see slight increases in the proportions of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, the right bank wines, in future years. Let's see if we've got any more questions. How much do you think these wines taste differently having been opened and placed in these tiny bottles a week or two ago versus when we opened them from the bottles directly today? If we opened them from the bottles directly today? Well, that's a good question. I think these are probably, and from my experience as well of tasting 2010s, these are looking just a little bit more open than we would normally expect of 2010s. And that's not a bad thing on a day like today. Like I said, in an ideal world, we probably should have had you try and open these an hour or an hour and a half before the webinar started. So I can see that they have been, they're a little bit more open than they would have been if we just opened them from the bottle. But with a great vintage like this, which is very structured and relatively shut down as well, it's probably not a bad thing. So I'm actually a little bit pleased that they've kind of gone through that experience and we woke them up a little bit, because it's much easier to see where the wines are going now. Good question, though. Okay, let's have a look. We got some more questions. What is the personal? I knew somebody's going to. Oh, personal favorite 2010 first growth. What's my personal favorite 2010 first growth? Well, that is a good question. Let me have a think about that. It's hard to play favorites. And in my business, we all have our favorite wines, and I have to sort of put my favorite or my preferences aside and try to look at everything objectively. But since you are asking me about my personal favorite, I really love Aubryon. I think that, for me, I just love the balance and the expression of that. I love, how it evolves at such a glacial pace, but it always maintains this sense of elegance and decorum. So if I had to pick one, that would probably be it. Let's see. What Bordeaux estates excite you right now as rising stars? Oh, okay, rising stars. There's a lot of rising stars in Bordeaux. I love it. There's just, it's such an old region and it's got so much tradition, but there's so much, that's happening right now. And we're seeing, changes of hands, and it's not just estates being bought and, investment being made. It's also, winemakers moving around. You can see, obviously, like Aymeric de Giron going to Trollong-Mondot, and all the exciting, new things that are happening there, evolving the style of Trollong-Mondot. That's an exciting development. I love, underdog estates that are really coming to the forefront, like Château La Roque in Saint-Emilion. There's so many little estates in Saint-Emilion and the Côte de Castillon as well. That are merging, people sort of, really embracing the great terroirs that they have, because there's a lot of wonderful, pockets of limestone that exist, throughout the right bank, not just on the famous limestone plateau of Saint-Emilion, for example, where, during these warmer vintages and with people really, focusing on precision viticulture now, we're seeing, some relatively modest and humble estates producing some spectacular wines now. So it's really hard to sort of narrow that down and say, which estates are doing it. But trust me, and this is what I try to highlight in every one of my reports is, these guys are doing a really good thing. And there's a lot of, fantastic underperforming previously estates to watch out there today in Bordeaux, probably now more than ever. It feels like with everything that we know about modern viticulture, and almost a sort of back to basics approach. The playing field's been a little bit leveled, and there's a lot of value to be found in Bordeaux now as well. I know that sounds crazy, but if you move outside of the the realms of classified growths, and you move outside of the famous names, there's a lot of discoveries to be made there now, and a lot of value to be found. So Good. Let's see what else we've got. Do you prefer a better vintage that is not quite ready or a lesser vintage that is ready to drink now, for drinking now? That's a good question, and it's probably a personal preference thing. But I and you know, really you probably should look at individual vintages as well. But you know, everybody has their vintage preferences and all of that. I like to have wines with a good amount of fruit, and I'm not saying that it has to be this big behemoth fruit bomb, but I do like it to have a nice core of fruit to it, and you know, some intensity and some layers there. And you really only, you know, get these things in a great vintage, unfortunately. So for example, were you to look at 2013, I find it, even though it's a vintage that's drinking well now, there's not a lot of wines that I find that I really want to embrace and love there, because it was a difficult year. Whereas, you know, you look at some of the 2010s. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to let any of these 2010s go to waste because they're just gorgeous, even though they're all too young. But they've got a great core of fruit, and I do like to have a little bit of primary fruit in the wines as well. I don't like to have to wait, you know, for the tannins to calm down in order to be able to approach these wines. I like to have a little fruit. So the tannins don't so much scare me in these wines. And when they're given some air and they're allowed to breathe, I think they're, you know, just beautiful to drink. Same with the 2009s. And then going into more recent vintages, you know, there's a whole shift in the way wines have started to be made from about 2015 onwards, or maybe you can even say 2014, where people are really focusing on quality tannins, in terms of, you know, isolating parcels out in the vineyard to pick, and, you know, making sure they're bringing phenolic ripeness into the winery, and then also making sure that they cut off the extraction before they start taking in too many of the harsh, hard tannins. And so what you're seeing, you know, with the 2015s, the 2016s, in particular, you know, two pretty great vintages. Well, 2016 was awesome. What you're seeing is, you know, a lot of the wines are approachable in their youth because they don't have those hard tannins that we saw even in 2005, which is another great vintage that I love, and we see in 2010. You know, I think, coming back to the question, I'm kind of straight off the question, but a better vintage nowadays is, you know, what I'd always opt for, and because I do want to have some fruit there. I want to have ripeness of tannins and all of those things that come with a great vintage and the layers, rather than a lesser vintage that's maybe drinking well now. I know that sounds really snooty, probably. Um, let's see. In terms of some vineyards trending towards biodynamic practices, what has the reaction been from other winemakers choosing to stick with tradition? You know, I don't blame anyone, for not going the biodynamic route. I think everybody has a certain responsibility to produce wine sustainably, and you know, we can't go back to the old days of just throwing chemicals at the situation. No, but you know, biodynamics is not for everyone. 100% organic is not for everyone. We've had some really tough vintages in recent years when it comes to mildew, and you know, trying to combat, you know, situations, or you know, really difficult outbreaks of mildew, when you have, you know, haven't got the means to do it. It can be really tough. So I don't blame, you know, winemakers if they don't want to go down the biodynamic route, and certainly I don't play favorites with people who are doing biodynamics. And you know, but we need to sort of maybe redefine what tradition is, and like I said, it can't be going back to all those chemicals in the on the vines and in the soils, and the other poor practice, or you know, lazy practices that you know were part and parcel of the past, not just in Bordeaux, and other regions as well. Great. I think we've got time for one more question. Any advice for a first-time traveler to Bordeaux? Oh, wow. Okay. Bordeaux is a big region. It's a lot of driving, and really, I think focusing in on your what area you're going to be in. Maybe you only have time to, for example, do the Medoc this trip, because the Medoc's going to take you a good 4 or 5 days, maybe. And it's quite a drive to get from the Medoc down to, Saint-Emilion and Pomerol or Pessac-Léognan and all of that. So really, I think, focus on an area of Bordeaux, whether you want to do right bank or left bank. If you have a longer trip, then you can probably do a few days in each. Don't forget about Pessac-Léognan, and you can, usually stay, in Bordeaux and head down there because it's not far. But drive carefully. It's no fun, doing the traffic and the road card. And enjoy some of the wonderful restaurants that they have there as well. The food scene is just, really taken off in Bordeaux now. But, really hone in, make your appointments well in advance. It can be sometimes difficult to sort of get appointments and putting your itinerary. I put my itineraries together for my visits to Bordeaux by myself. That alone can take you a week just to put together your own itinerary. But knowing where the properties are, and just, look at a good map of Bordeaux and understanding the driving distances between them is going to make all the difference when you're putting together your itinerary, because it can be a logistical nightmare, trust me. Okay, I think that's it. We've covered all the questions and all of that, and we've come up just to the hour. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to come back and taste these wines, to experience wines in these little bottles, which I'm pretty impressed with, actually. It's worked very well, particularly for this very structured 2010 vintage. And I've really enjoyed the questions that you asked and being able to do this masterclass. I hope everyone has a really wonderful Thanksgiving week. I always think of Thanksgiving as a week, not just a day. And happiest of holidays to everyone out there. Thank you. Bye.